Alright, so in this one, I'm going to be talking about and explaining what makes Saitama so ridiculously powerful, like everything that goes into it, and why it's like statistically unlikely for him to ever lose a fight. I mean, like, against anyone, if you know what I mean. So in chapter 11, Saitama tells Carnage Kabuto, Dr. Genis, and Genos that what matters is continuing this hard training menu, and that he was able to get this strong in 3 years. And then we get the iconic 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, and running 10 kilometers every day. Also eat 3 meals a day, even just a banana will do for breakfast. So train your spirit, never use heat in the winter or air conditioning in the summer. It'll almost kill you early on and you'll consider taking a day off. But I wanted to be a strong hero, so I persevered every day, even if I vomited blood. Even when I felt so heavy I could barely move, I did squats. Even if my arms made weird popping sounds, I did push-ups. And then 1 year later, he noticed a change. He was bald, but he'd gotten stronger. And it's not until chapter 86 that we truly understand what Saitama actually did here, because after hearing this, Dr. Genis was able to quantify it somewhat, and he explains it to Zombie Man by saying that Saitama had removed his limiter. And as for the limiter, he says no matter how much an organism strives, there are limits to its growth. An overabundance of strength is a burden to its bearer, giving rise to complications. Those who become monsters shed their original selves and rage out of control. For that reason, God has designed each creature to grow within parameters that allow for survival and preservation of reason, and the mechanism for controlling that growth is called a limiter. But Saitama had forced himself beyond his boundaries and thereby succeeded in removing his limiter. And I'm sure a lot of us know that by now. But an interesting thing that Dr. Genis says is that those who become monsters shed their original selves and rage out of control, showing that there is kind of like a parallel between what Saitama has done and what others do when becoming monsters. And this dichotomy is actually shown to us throughout the series, represented in Garo's path as well as Saitama's. Garo's path, of course, eventually leads to him becoming Cosmic Fear Garo, as to where Saitama's leads him to becoming Saitama. And in chapter 90, Psychos explains to Garo the monster side of this by saying that in order to accelerate the monsterization transformation, you must repeatedly overcome death as a human through extreme challenges to body and soul. It sounds easy, but it's actually quite difficult and can result in death. Many who survive become mindless, mediocre brutes, incapable of further progress. This lines up with what Dr. Genis was saying about how an overabundance of strength is a burden to its bearer. Those who become monsters shed their original selves and rage out of control. But going further, Psychos also says that the key is subjecting you to hellish conditions perfectly suited to your level. And this lines up with what Saitama was doing. You know, the push-ups, the sit-ups, eating 3 meals a day, never using heat in the winter or air conditioning in the summer, and just doing it every single day, even if you feel like you're dying. So while this sequence is comical, of course, because it was intended to be, it was also showing that Saitama had pretty much inadvertently created the perfect hellish condition suited to his level in order for him to get to the point of removing his limiter. But going further, Psycho says that she learned that overcoming death brought advancement to a higher stage, and that each time resulted in exponential growth. And we actually see Saitama do this as well, or at least in my opinion we do. Because if we go to the bonus chapter from volume 2 called Brushing Up, we see Saitama 300 days into his training. And at this point, he's really feeling it. Like, we see him like keeling over during his training and truly suffering, more so than what we saw of that montage in the anime. And he says, I've been training for 300 days. In response to the repetitive movements, my body's abilities have really taken off. But that pain again, I'm feeling it more frequently. Have I pushed myself too hard? And it really looks like Saitama is like pushing himself to death for sure. But later on in this chapter, he eventually encounters this tiger level monster by the name of the incarnation of the electric light string. And this monster just destroys Saitama at first. And it gets to the point of where Saitama's like, this is no time for crying, my limits. I must surpass my limits. Until he eventually gets hit with this massive strike that like puts him in a wall. And the following sequence, I guess, is up for interpretation for sure, but we see Saitama fall over and it looks like he straight up dies here. We also have the losing of the tooth parallel between him and Garo as well. And he says, well, so much for that cavity. Then he suddenly gets up and his expression has now changed into the more comical, nonchalant one that we've come to know of Saitama currently. And now he's just strong enough to just one punch the electric light string monster. So in my opinion, this is pretty much what Psychos was telling to Garo. Overcoming death brought advancement to a higher stage and resulted each time in exponential growth. So along with what Saitama was doing with his standard training, one of the more important aspects of it was him fighting monsters that were much stronger than him along the way. And I guess it's being insinuated that he had overcome death at least multiple times, and along with his other training and never taking a day off, subjecting himself to hellish conditions perfectly suited for his level, he eventually removed his limiter. And as for removing his limiter, well, to be honest, we don't really get too much insight into that until recently. Because when Saitama is fighting Cosmic Fear Garo, we see that Garo has become strong enough to match Saitama's current level of power, which no one else before this was able to do. And in response to that, we see what Saitama's true power is, because the narrator tells us that Saitama was continuing to grow. Until now, no one had equaled him in strength or noticed his growth. However, due to his intense emotion, his abilities were rising exponentially. He was even pulling away from the only person capable of observing his growth. Perhaps no one existed who could even fathom his new heights of strength. So what this means is that when Saitama removed his limiter, he didn't become like omnipotent, and then he wasn't also just given an unlimited power level, or however you want to quantify it. It means that he has no limit to his power, meaning that he can always get stronger if pushed far enough. Because as we see here, Saitama went from his standard level of strength that we've seen of him throughout the series, you know, like Sirius punching the sky apart and whatnot, but due to him having no limiter and being able to infinitely increase his power if pushed far enough, he became so strong that he could literally sneeze the surface of Jupiter away. Yes, this actually happens. So in theory, this also means that if there was someone even stronger than Cosmic Fear Garo and they kept pushing Saitama, he could eventually get strong enough to possibly even destroy the entire universe with a single strike. So yeah, that's the secret of Saitama's power, is that he has no limit to it and that he'll always get stronger in a standard fight. I do think Saitama is going to lose in the future of the series, but not necessarily in a fight, and I'm going to be talking about that in another video. So volume 25 of One Punch Man has been released, and with it we got a nice little bonus chapter. We also got some volume extras, which are standard, but the bonus chapter that we got is pretty interesting, at least to me. I mean, it's mostly just tongue-in-cheek, and it's just a funny little thing that one Murata just put in there for our amusement. But also, if you're a weirdo like me and like to read too much into the story, then it has a lot of meaning to it, because it gives us a glimpse of Saitama on his path to removing his limiter. Something that we don't really get too much insight into, actually. I mean, we see the beginning of it, you know, in the first episode when he takes on Crablante, and that eventually leads him on his path, which we wind up seeing in the Road to Hero OVA, which is great, by the way. You should really check that out if you haven't already. In my opinion, it's essential One Punch Man viewing. But after that, at least on the timeline of Saitama in his training years, we intermittently see it here and there in a few bonus chapters, and I'll talk about another one of those because it kind of ties into this one. But outside of that, you know, we don't really see too much, and the timeline itself is kind of spotty. And speaking of the timeline, thankfully we're actually getting some confirmed time in this bonus chapter as well, because it says that it's taking place about 1.5 years ago. And I made a video a few years ago about how strong Saitama would have been if he didn't remove his limiter, meaning like how strong he would have been if he got to the point of where he was about to remove it but didn't, and kind of just stayed at the level cap. And within that video, I kind of mapped out the timeline as best as I could, and what we're getting here is kind of lining up with what I thought was the time of him like approaching the point of removing his limiter, because it goes back to chapter 11 when Saitama gives us the initial insight into his training and what led to him removing his limiter. Because when he's talking to Dr. Genus and Carnage Kabuto, he says, "I was able to get this strong in 3 years. 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats every day." But he says after continuously doing this, 1 year later, he noticed a change, and he was bald, but he had gotten stronger. Now that whole statement there is a little ambiguous because he says 1 year later, despite saying 3 years ago initially when he started his training. But in this bonus chapter, we see that he still has his hair despite it saying about a year and a half ago. So I suppose we're just supposed to take our own account of time into consideration here, compensating for the amount of time that he went through initially before it was 1 year later. So when we see these panels here of him, you know, going through the training and whatnot, this was a couple months already. And then after that, 1 year later, that's when he lost his hair. Now that brings us to the other bonus chapter that I was talking about that kind of ties into this, because in the volume 3 bonus chapter, Summer, I think when we see Saitama in that chapter, I think it's pretty much around the same time that we're seeing Saitama in this chapter, because I also talked about that in my video about how strong Saitama would have gotten if he didn't remove his limiter, and I don't know how I came up with a year and a half. Maybe I did the same chapter 11 calculation, because in that chapter, that's the strongest that we see Saitama pre him being bald. Like, he's able to one-shot a demon level cicada nymph monster in that chapter, which is pretty cool, because I guess this is the only instance of us seeing Saitama at like an objective S-class level, if you will. I mean, it's possible he was even stronger than S-class, but I just say that because this is like more comparable to one of like the stronger S-class level feats. And also the fact that he still has his hair, of course, but in this chapter we see he has like a bald spot and his hair is like coming out as he's running, which, you know, is showing us like, oh, you know, this is close to him either removing his limiter or his limiter was starting to break, as it said with Garo when he was going against Darkshine. And we can see how one tries to distinguish between the two, although he has been very, I'll say it again, ambiguous with the limiter. But it also draws more parallels between Saitama and Garo, I think, because Garo, on his path to breaking and or removing his limiter, or in his own words, attaining disaster level god, he went through the left path of, you know, becoming a monster slowly but surely, firstly being like a wishful monster and then becoming the half human hybrid monster thing that he was, and until where he is currently in the manga, where he's like 98 or 99% a monster but still hasn't removed his limiter. And I say that because, in my opinion at least, you can't be a monster and remove your limiter. Like what Dr. Gina says in chapter 86 is pretty much the truth. God, like the being that we see visit Homeless Emperor, did in fact put a limiter on all of humans who are under his system. And I go way more in depth in this in my video, Why People Become Monsters, so check that video out. But anyway, coming back to this volume 25 bonus chapter, this could be the follow-up to the summer bonus chapter. Or it could be before that, maybe, not really sure, but it's around the same time for sure. But anyway, after doing his, you know, standard training for that day, we see Saitama in the shower afterwards, and he has like more hair in his hands, and I'm sure this relates to a lot of us in real life. I mean, I know so many of you have perfect hair genetics, but some of us, you know, like myself, who don't, our hair, you know, comes out in our hands in the shower, unfortunately. Also, some serious Murata fan service in this chapter too. But Saitama like digging through his hair more and more, and he says, feels like my hair swirl is getting bigger. I'm afraid what the back of my head looks like now, but I only have one mirror. Maybe if I turn around fast enough, I could see it. Then we see Saitama, you know, standing back to the mirror so that it has the reflection of the back of his head. And then we see him trying to turn around fast enough as to where he can see the back of his head's reflection faster than the mirror can keep up with him turning around. He's like, oh God, let's do it again and again. And he keeps trying and he keeps failing. And then we see him like get serious, and we start seeing like the aura come around him, and he keeps trying again and again until eventually the narration says, whether this was true, there is no way to verify, but at that instance, Saitama did in fact catch a glimpse of the back of his head. So yeah, Saitama is Saitama, and he somehow breaks the laws of physics here, and he's able to move so fast that the mirror is unable to keep up with his speed, and he's able to see pretty much the past of the reflection of the back of his head. This is great one writing here, and I just wish this bonus chapter was a little longer, because to be honest, a lot of one's talent really comes out in his bonus chapters. Like, some of the best chapters in the entire series are like the earlier bonus chapters. But this moment in time, has he removed his limiter yet, or is he like breaking it? I don't know. It really depends on who you ask. I mean, if you ask like one of the pedantic psychos on a certain social media platform, they'll get real aggressive with you and tell you, this is the way that it is, this is what happened, and if you say otherwise, you're an idiot. Or if you ask other people, they'll say, hey, you know, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. If you ask me, I'll say, you know, the whole limiter stuff and breaking and removing and timelines, at this point, it's kind of up for interpretation until one explicitly makes it clear exactly what is going on. And besides, just with the whole removing the limiter aspect, he hasn't really done that yet. Okay, so I'm finally getting around to making my series of videos that's going to be explaining the truth about One Punch Man. Going to be starting with this one, explaining who Saitama actually is, or more so what he is based off of, and that will show us what the overall series is about and where it's headed. It's going to take me many videos to explain all of this stuff, so please subscribe, because, you know, over the next couple weeks I'm going to be releasing them. So let's just get it out there immediately. Saitama is the Egyptian god of the sun, Ra, and he kind of always was. And more so, the story of One Punch Man was always kind of the myth of Osiris in a way. It's not a one-for-one recreation, of course, just similar in the way that like Naruto and One Piece aren't one-for-one recreations of Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, but it's more or less kind of following the same path. And there is some Tale of the Bamboo Cutter in One Punch Man as well, but it also ties back to the myth of Osiris and just Egyptian mythology in general. So first, let me just give you Wikipedia's description of Ra, and that way I could further expand upon how he is Saitama and how Saitama is him. So Ra was the Egyptian deity of the sun. He had become one of the most important gods in Egyptian religion, identified primarily with the noonday sun. Ra was believed to rule in all parts of the created world, the sky, the earth, and the underworld. He was the god of the sun, order, kings, and the sky. Since the people regarded Ra as a principal god, creator of the universe, and source of life, he had a strong influence on them, which led to him being one of the most worshipped of all Egyptian gods, and even considered king of the gods. At an early period in Egyptian history, his influence spread throughout the whole country, bringing multiple representations in form and in name. The most common form combinations are with Atum, his human form, and Khepri, the scarab beetle, and Horus, the falcon. So let's just stop there for a second. So the most obvious example of this is King. King is Atum and Saitama's human form. And I've obviously been talking about this for years, and it was right in front of my face the whole time. Notice how I've always been saying that Saitama and King are two sides of the same coin. They both represent absolute power. King is who everyone sees as absolute power. However, Saitama is literally the absolute power. And of course, this was always purposely crafted by one, but the more significant meaning is this. Ra is a god who goes by many names, and that is why King's name is King, because, you know, Saitama is like the true king. They're the king of gods, just like how Ra was. Also, another reason why all of Saitama's huge feats in the beginning of the series are associated with King. Defeating Vaccine Man, defeating Beefcake, etc. This is also why the sequence of Saitama meeting King plays out the way that it does. When we see King before he becomes an S-class hero, he's encountered by the Octopus Claw Man. But if you'll look closer, you'll see that the Octopus Claw Man represents the moon, and his left eye is being slashed. That's because the left represents the eye of Horus, and the right represents the eye of Ra. But I'll get more into the eye symbology in a little bit. But also, when King is saved by Saitama, he is first seen with the sun glaring behind him.
the light coming down on King.
Now, Khepri, on the other hand, is a little more ambiguous to the story, but it does make sense, and I think this will be more prevalent in future developments that are actually currently happening right now, and we'll come back to Khepri, but right now I'll just say that he's very likely to be Zombie Man, and I know that sounds far-fetched, like, Zombie Man, he's not really that important. Well, maybe not right now, but it's very likely that he is going to become extremely important later on in the story, and more so heavily tied to Saitama. But like I said, I'll come back to Khepri because there actually is symbology for him, just like there is symbology for many things in this story, and it's pretty cool. So going back to Ra, on top of his head sits a solar disc with a cobra, which in many myths represent the Eye of Ra. Okay, let's stop there. So as we can see, this is how Ra is depicted. Falcon's head with the sun on top. This symbology has always been present to us within the series. In fact, it's been present even before One Punch Man was a thing, because some of you hardcores out there know that one's like original kind of story for this was called Taiyo Man, and Taiyo means sun, sun man, Ra, god of the sun. And I'm pretty sure that's why Saitama is bald, to represent the sun. That's like it. That's like the main reasoning behind it. I mean, aside from that, just being bald makes him iconic and stick out from the rest of the cookie cutter manga heroes. But it more so just represents that he is Ra, the god of the sun. And another way that one cleverly shows us this is back in the martial arts tournament. When Saitama puts on his Shiranko wig, that is representing the sun, and that he is Ra.
Also, when Saitama takes up the name of Shiranko in that tournament, it goes back to Ra being a god who goes by many names.
And just a little side note here, another symbology that we see in the martial arts tournament is Garo wearing the Wolfman mask. That is meant to represent that he is Anubis. And yes, I'll talk about him in another video, as well as all of the other S-class heroes and characters in this series who are based on Egyptian gods. It does not stop with Saitama, King, and Zombie Man. It goes much, much deeper than that. But also the Eye of Ra is mentioned here. And if you follow my videos, you know lately I've been talking about how one uses left and right symbology, especially with the eyes, and this is where it's coming from. Right eye represents the Eye of Ra, which, you know, is the good, the light, the sun, Saitama, as where the left eye is the Eye of Horus. That represents the moon, bad things, darkness, and God, like the character from One Punch Man. Again, I'll be explaining all of this in much further detail later on in another video. Just that right there should already be able to show you the truth about most of these characters, and that's because we see the singular eye represented so much within this series. And whenever you see that, it is for sure telling us that they are a disciple of God because they are bearing the Eye of Horus. Now, which characters exhibit these eyes? Well, Boros, of course. That's because Boros was always kind of in one's mind. I mean, you could see that he was a part of Taiyo Man originally with the whole 20 years too strong villain thing. And I've been talking about this for a long time, that Boros is connected to God in some way, and he pretty much is, and I'll explain that later. But the most prominent singular eye that we see is Drive Knight. That's because Drive Knight is Horus, but Drive Knight, aka Horus, is just ultimately a disciple of Osiris, who is God. Goes back to the myth of Osiris. And that's just what this whole series comes down to. The sun versus the moon. Saitama versus God. You probably heard me say in, I don't know, a few videos or something that I really like One Punch Man because I feel like it's like the perfect fusion of Dragon Ball Z and One Piece. You get like the one-dimensional strong fighting guys aspect of Dragon Ball Z combined with the three-dimensional aspects of One Piece with world building, character development, and extensive lore. But little did I know I was much closer to the truth than I actually knew, because they're both telling the same story, which is just the sun versus the moon. One Piece ultimately comes down to sun god Nika versus the moon goddess Imu. And it just doesn't stop there. I guess this is really the origin of all storytelling, because the sun and the moon obviously have always been a thing as long as humanity has been around. The sun gives light,
brings the day, brings life, but when the moon comes out, then the darkness comes and it takes away the light and the sun goes away. Brings fear, other things like that. So the age-old story of humanity has always been the sun versus the moon, or the light versus the dark. But back to the Ra mythology. Ra was believed to have created all forms of life by calling them into existence by uttering their secret names. In some accounts, humans were created from Ra's tears and sweat. And we actually do see this happening in chapter 86, which is, I guess, the most important chapter in the series, possibly, next to like chapter 22. So in that chapter, we see Dr. Zhoniin explaining the limiter and just monsters in general to Zombie Man. Remember, could be Khepri. And this also again shows the genius of one's writing, because he is literally telling us the truth here, but he's just disguising it as like normal dialogue. So when he's explaining the limiter to Zombie Man, he says, no matter how much an organism strives, there are limits to its growth. An overabundance of strength is a burden to its bearer. For that reason, God has designed each creature to grow within parameters that allow for survival and preservation of reason, and the mechanism for controlling that growth is called a limiter. So that statement right there has obviously been talked about and dissected for years, and I personally have been asked, like, is Dr. Zhoniin talking about the God character there? And I always thought, like, well, no, because how would Dr. Zhoniin know about God? And if he did, he would just tell Zombie Man. And this goes back to one telling us the truth but disguising it as just normal harmless dialogue. Dr. Zhoniin, the character himself, is just saying God as, like, you know, nature or whatever, but one himself literally means God, the character here, aka Osiris, because God has literally done this to all of the organisms, I think pretty much in the universe. Maybe, I'm not really sure how far his reach goes at this point, but we have gotten some more insight into that with Blast's Green Lantern Corps thing. But God has done this. He has put a limiter onto living beings so that they can only become so strong as to where they cannot challenge him the way that Saitama eventually will. And in another video, I'll explain how he has done this, because that too has been shown to us. The reason why people become monsters and the way that God's system has been imposed on, I guess, most life-bearing planets. And that too is pretty genius how one did it. But going further, Dr. Zhoniin says regarding Saitama, but that man, he forced himself beyond his boundaries and thereby succeeding in removing his limiter, and he suffers suffocating isolation. After he defeated my greatest warrior with a single punch, the look on his face told it all. And Carnage Kabuto is actually kind of important too, because it goes back to the whole Khepri thing. The most common Ra form combinations are with Atum, King, his human form, and Khepri, the scarab beetle, along with Horus the falcon. Now, what was Carnage Kabuto originally referred to as? The ultimate life form. Obviously, it was not him. The ultimate life form is Saitama. And also, in this chapter, we see a little hanging ornament thing of Carnage Kabuto. And in the final page of Dr. Zhoniin's exposition here, we see it hanging over Zombie Man's head. And Khepri is often represented as a scarab holding aloft the morning sun, or a scarab-headed man. And I won't really go too much into spoilers here, but it's not a coincidence what's going on with Zombie Man right now in the webcomic, especially since Khepri is associated with being the god of resurrection. But anyway, going further, Zombie Man says, I know many monsters who disregard their strength limits. When they don't become actual monsters, the world calls them heroes. Then Dr. Zhoniin says, when humans become monsters, there's an explosion of frustration resulting from unsatisfied desires and the urge to transform. Driven by destructive behaviors and psychological complexes, the individual's past circumstances and other factors may give rise to cellular abnormalities and spontaneous mutation. These are reborn as new creatures, but they retain their limiters. Broadly speaking, the sea folk who attacked City J and the aliens who attacked City A were also monsters, but they were natural creatures with an innate animosity towards humankind. Again, Boros is shown here with the Eye of Horus. He is for sure a product of God in some way. It is not a coincidence that he was sent to Earth, especially with the alien seer looking Lovecraftian, similar to how Orochi does. But then going further, he says, by contrast, heroes work hard to develop innate talents, thereby acquiring the incredible powers that allow them to stand against monsters. And then he goes on to talk about Saitama some more, and he says, but he was different. He was a normal person of ordinary birth with an ordinary lifestyle and no particular talent. Yet through sheer effort, he forced open his limits and demolished his limiter. Now, what do we see in this panel right here? Saitama sweating, and he has a tear coming from his eye. Going back to what we talked about with Ra, man was created from Ra's tears and sweat. Saitama's tears and sweat, which he gave for many days in order to remove his limiter, gave birth to someone who was strong enough to overcome God and stop the cycle, therefore giving birth to the true humans who are no longer under the influence of God's system. This is, of course, the end result of the series, but that's where I want to end the video because I don't know how long it's going to be at this point, but like I said, there's so much more that I need to talk about, and I'll just give you a little preview as to what's to come. I'm going to talk about the truth about Drive Knight, of course, about how he is the most significant villain in the series outside of God. Going to be explaining God himself because he has a whole other rabbit hole to him, and it's actually been shown to us in the series the truth about him and where the story is headed with him as well. Also going to be talking about the Psychic Sisters and which one of them is going to wind up being with Saitama. Yes, that's going to be a thing. Going to be talking more about Psychos, Orochi, talking more about Genos and Metal Knight and Drive Knight and how all three of their storylines are going to converge in a pretty cool way. And of course, in that video, I'll explain why Metal Knight wasn't a villainous traitor the whole time and where his base is actually located, probably. Also, why people become monsters and the system that God has put in place. And then eventually, I'll be explaining what the next big arc of One Punch Man is going to be, which is already kind of being set up right now in the webcomic, and why Drive Knight and Psychos are going to defeat Saitama. Yes, it is going to happen, but I mean, he'll come back and win eventually, but there will be a point where he is defeated. So today we're going to be talking about the Saitama group, easily one of the greatest teams ever to be in manga and or anime. And as we can see, this team consists of Saitama, King, Silverfang, and Genos. So I want to talk about them, of course, but I also want to talk about the bonus chapter that really brings light on this group and kind of gives them a name, I suppose. And that is one of the best chapters in all of One Punch Man, which is Numbers. Now, I've talked about this chapter in my other video about Child Emperor's power level reader mask thing. And there's a lot more that happens in it other than just the Okami mask. This chapter also introduces the Saitama group. So in this chapter, Fubuki, along with the Blizzard group, is still trying to draft Saitama. That's because this is released in volume 10, which happens, like around the time of season 2. So this, whole little storyline is still fresh in the reader's mind. So they get Saitama to come to some random location or something, and they're, trying to recruit him, but he's playing a video game under the desk. And this is one of the funniest panels of Saitama I've ever seen, the way this face looks here. But of course, he rejects them. And then Fubuki raises an interesting proposition to Saitama. She's like, hey, let's fight. And of course, this catches his attention because, Saitama is interested in fighting. And she says, your group against mine, and the loser has to do what the winner says. Bring your group here tomorrow, and I'll explain the rules then. And Saitama's like, I don't have a group. She's like, oh, then just come alone. I guess you aren't very popular. So Saitama actually does wind up showing up to, which turns out to be a rented meeting room, which like a conference hall, like a hotel that the Blizzard group rented out for 2 hours specifically for this event that they're gonna have. And yeah, you guessed it, Saitama shows up with King, Genos, and Silverfang, and the follow-up panel lists all of their ranks just to further show how incredibly deep and ridiculous this team is, and how Saitama is so nonchalant about it. It doesn't really matter to him because, he's Saitama, but he's rolling with 3 of the most powerful heroes in the world, And rightfully so, the Blizzard group is like crapping their pants in reaction to seeing Saitama roll in with this group of gods. Then she has Saitama sign the contract, and as she said, the previous day, the loser has to do whatever the winner says. She put that in fine print and reminds Saitama that is the stipulation for the winner here. And he's like, oh, did it say that? Then they all like move the stuff in the room away because it looks like they're about to straight up like throw down in a fight. And this excites Bang. He's like, I'm going to teach them a lesson and I'm going to make them, join my dojo as grunts. We get another little funny instance of Psycho Bang here. But it turns out that they're not actually going to have a physical fight. But they're going to have like a video game like tournament, between the two teams. And Bang is the first one up. And yeah, as you expected, Bang gets completely destroyed. It actually says that Bang like keeps hitting like the taunt button. So his character just keeps taunting. And you can actually see it. It's like he's like slapping his butt. And he just gets destroyed. And it's also revealed that Fubuki has a former pro gamer, a part of her team. And this is the first time we're introduced to it, pretty much the only time. And that's Pico, who is B class rank 65. So then Geno steps up to go against Pico, presumably. And he mashes the buttons on the controller so hard that he winds up breaking it and he loses as a result of that. They're like, pressing the buttons harder doesn't make the attack stronger. So then after that, Saitama steps up, and Saitama is so goofily confident about this game because he's like, I played this before. I ain't no amateur like Bang and Genos. I'll win this in just a jiffy. And then he just gets perfected by Pico. Like he just gets, destroyed. Actually, the worst, I suppose, of everyone so far. At least it's implied. So then, yeah, only King is left. And Fubuki is really confident at this point. But us, the readers, know that King is pretty much the one above all in video games. Now, at this time, maybe you would have been a little unsure if King could have beaten a former pro gamer. But it turns out that, yes, not only does King defeat Pico, off panel, we don't see it, but he defeats everyone that's in the Blizzard group here. Like, she says that she brought 30 members with her, and he defeats all of them, and I guess it's applied rather easily. And as per the stipulations of the match and the bet, I suppose, the loser has to do whatever the winner wants, and Saitama just says that Fubuki has to take them out to dinner, and then we get like a little nice comical ending sequence where she's like counting calories. But another little bonus to the Saitama group that we get in this chapter is them actually working together, and they're somewhat of a cohesive unit. It's just like, I really like that one kind of sprinkled this in here just to show that aside from them just being like a force, like, from like a face value, they also do work together because we see that like Bang, he covers like the rescue and evacuation aspect of like the hero team because he swipes in and saves Red Muffler from Spiderino, another speed feat from Bang that I always forget about. Then Geno steps in and he incineration blasts like the top part of Spiderino off, and then Saitama comes in and just one punches the spider body, and then he gets covered in the webs comically. And King is King. He's just there to assure that they cannot lose. But aside from this awesome chapter, I just like the Saitama group existence and just it being acknowledged because it really is like the MC's team of this series. Like every shonen series or whatever. I'm not saying One Punch Man is a shonen. It's like a pseudo shonen or whatever. But they all have like their group or their team or whatever. And this is Saitama's group. Aside from like the moniker around it, it's like one way or another, Saitama does have like a team of friends, if you will. It's ambiguous how Saitama feels about all of these individuals deep down, but you can consider them his friends, like especially King and Geno somewhat, and even Silverfang. It goes deeper than this, of course. You could consider Bomb a part of the Saitama group, and even Fubuki somewhat as a part of this. We do see all of these characters congregating in his apartment from time to time. So it's like, yeah, this is Saitama's team, his friend group or his friend circle. He doesn't need it, of course, but it's just fun the way that he has it and the way that their dynamics all work. Because also this team is mainly comprised of people that know the truth about Saitama. Like, they're all aware that he is the one above all, aside from like Fubuki, who's still kind of in delusion about it. But the rest of them, there is no delusion about it. And another interesting thing here is that Saitama is the only one who is aware that King is not actually the strongest man on Earth. And then also the whole thing about, King and Saitama being two sides of the same coin. And I'm going to make a whole video about that.
Majid Boros asks, I read some comments on different videos seeing that Garo taking serious punches and clashing serious punches with Saitama is problematic because Garo in no way, shape, or form should be able to take Saitama's full force like nothing, and many things aren't making sense for the plot as well. So thank you for bringing this up. I wanted to talk about this in a video regardless because I didn't really go too much into it in my review. So in chapter 167, after Saitama and Garo are blasted to Io, the moon of Jupiter, Saitama says, oh well, at least I can let loose at full power against a guy who could stay up. I may have finally gotten what I wished for, but I'm not the slightest bit excited. Now, as I said in my review, that's like a problematic statement. And I personally trust the translations of Nitrote and Grey words. I think this is, more or less what he's actually saying. And with that, I suppose, just like many things in the series, it's up for interpretation. Now, at least in my opinion, the way that I see this is that he's not like literally using full power. I mean, if you just see Saitama in this chapter, clearly he's not worried at all. I mean, he's freaking holding Genos's core the whole time. And Garo himself says, this guy, he's completely unfazed. Is he even human? Saitama is also like telling Garo to like come at him in this chapter too. He's like, forget your little tricks, referring to using the hyperspace gates, and come at me with your fists. Is that what you call the ultimate martial arts? Then after Saitama does the serious table flip and throws Garo like off of his own internal access, he winds up teleporting into like the surface of Io, thinking that he was actually escaping. He says, I completely lost my sense of direction, like a caged insect being played with by a child. This is pretty much telling us the story of this fight. An insect being played with by a child. It's not really that competitive. So when Saitama says, I can let loose, use my full power, I think he more so means like, I don't have to worry about Earth or the people there. I can kind of just do what I want to do, casually throwing around serious moves. And I finally have an opponent who's not going to be completely vaporized by me using that level of power. And also, I think at least, Saitama doesn't want to kill Garo. He still knows that he's like a human. It's not like he completely forgot the moments that he had with Garo before he became Cosmic Fear mode. The whole thing about him trying to bring Garo around to his humanity. He saw the relationship that he had with Terrio. He saw that Garo is deeply conflicted. And I'm pretty sure Saitama knows that Garo is ultimately trying to do the right thing. I mean, he is like one of the great anti-villains of battle manga. And with that, he knows that he is being corrupted by God here. So with that, I doubt he's really trying to kill him. And I do think that if Saitama really wanted to, he could probably vaporize him with one strike. And as for people saying that it's too early in the story for Garo to be this strong or for someone to be taking serious strikes the way that he is, well, I don't think so. I think this is more so just the sequel to the Boros fight, which, happened very early on in the story. And I'm sure some people had gripes with it at that time. Like, oh wow, it's too early on in the story for somebody to be this powerful and taking a punch from Saitama. The story's called One Punch Man. He's supposed to be defeating everybody with one punch. What the heck is this? But obviously, as the years and time has gone by, we have no problem with Boros and how strong he was. We actually revered it. In the last 8 years, we've kind of just compared everyone to Boros, right? We put him on this pedestal, but now he's coming off of that pedestal and being replaced by Cosmic Fear Garo. So for the next 8 years or however long, everyone hereafter will be compared to Cosmic Fear Garo. And I think that's one of the core aspects of this series. When you have a character like Saitama, who I always refer to as the one above all, meaning that there are none above him, not even God, no one else. He will always be the strongest. It's hard to make stakes at that point, because if you look at it for what it is, there are no stakes, at least in relation to Saitama, and there never was. So you have to create the illusion of stakes here. And I think that's what one has done. I mean, clearly, since there are many people that are confused or angry or just not on board with what's happening here because they think that Saitama is truly being challenged here, or that there's even a chance that Garo could win. And I've said this many times before as well, but the dynamic of Saitama's like true opponents are just going to come down to who can push him the furthest, who can get him to show the audience the most of what he's capable of. And that's what we're seeing here. With Boros, he pushed Saitama enough to be able to survive his regular punches and got to the point of where he used a serious punch to take him out, or just to stop his ultimate attack. And naturally, we go to the next level as to where somebody can survive Saitama's serious punches and even match his serious punches in a way and convince a portion of the audience that Saitama is actually in danger here, or that his opponent is simply too strong. So I just think that everything is working the way that it should. I mean, isn't this what we always wanted? I'm not sure why people are upset with this, because this is kind of the trajectory of the series, right? But rather than just taking everything so literally and seeing it for what it is on the surface, take a look for what it actually is, and it's Saitama is being Saitama, and this is just the natural progression of the series, with one giving us the illusion of stakes. And that's just one of the many reasons why this series is so great and pretty unique. So Kingsley basically asked that if the black hole that was left in the sky after Saitama and Garo had been transported to Io, the moon of Jupiter, does that mean that the stars or the galaxies in that portion of space were destroyed as a result of the two serious punches colliding? So let me first go into what led to that point, and then we can try to figure out what may or may not have happened afterwards. So in chapter 167, as Saitama and Garo's serious punches are about to collide, blast at the last second tries to teleport them away from Earth so that, you know, the resulting explosion doesn't destroy it. And he winds up getting them above the Earth, and he says the energy is too great. The gate, I can't get enough distance. I have to at least find a way to deflect the destructive energy away from Earth. But then suddenly 3 members of his team show up and help him close the hyperspace gate. And as we see it closing in like a Pac-Man-like shape, the energy being condensed here shoots out in a beam, and that beam contains like Saitama and Garo and winds up shooting them all the way to Io, the moon of Jupiter. Now, after the hyperspace gate or whatever they did to contain this explosion completely shuts, we see like this black hole left in the wake of it. And they say, what happened to those two? Did they get blown away? The repercussion from that energy, I have no idea how far they went. So that, along with us seeing the beam hitting Io, pretty much confirms that, you know, that's kind of what happened. I don't think a wormhole or a literal black hole opened up here. I mean, it is possible, but I just don't think that's likely. Now, another thing that I don't think is likely is that all of the stars and the galaxies here were destroyed as well. Because first of all, that's just a little too fantastical for this point in the story. And considering how close this was to Earth, it probably would have been destroyed as well. Or at least some kind of cosmic cataclysmic event would have happened. And I also don't think we're going to get to the point of seeing Saitama do galactic feats until towards like the end of the series. I do think he's capable of that. I know that's maybe hard to believe that anybody besides Goku can do stuff like that, but I'm pretty sure Saitama could and eventually will, but probably saving that stuff towards the end. What I think probably happened here, and just keep in mind that I'm an idiot, I don't really know anything about anything, but it's possible that since Blast's abilities, and possibly his teams as well, seem to revolve around gravity manipulation, and they used, in theory, a hyperspace gate to contain that explosion, and the foundation for creating the hyperspace gate involves the manipulation of gravity, I think we're just seeing light being bent around the resulting manipulation of gravity in this area. So that's why we don't see the stars or the light or anything, because the light is simply being distorted in this one circular area in the sky or in space, or at least just from the perspective of the audience. And another thing that makes me think this is something that has always stuck with me since I heard it, and that's when Bob Lazar described how UFOs are able to fly and move move around and stuff like that on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I'll play the clip here.
You really have to look at the way the gravity wave comes out of the craft, and it produces a heart-shaped gravitational distortion around the craft. Now, if the craft is sitting in the air and you walk underneath it and look up, you actually cannot see the craft. The light bends around it. You're bending gravity, bends light. It bends radio waves.
So that kind of lines up with what's happening here, maybe. I mean, it makes sense to me, but then again, like I said, I'm an idiot, and I'm sure there's going to be tons of people that are going to be angry with what I'm saying here, but this is one possibility as to what's going on here. Light just being distorted by gravity manipulation. So yeah, I don't think Saitama / Garo destroyed stars or galaxies. It's just less fantastical than that, but still pretty cool. Jaboros asks, do you think Saitama going back in time and losing his character development by not remembering all of the events that had happened in the past chapters is just pointless? Why couldn't they just let him remember all the events so in the future he could just consider a different approach in upcoming fights or dilemmas? So I don't think it was pointless, and while he did lose the development from not having the experiences or the memories anymore, I think his overall character was very much developed by one in chapter 169 especially, and it more so let the audience know what Saitama truly is, or at least in my opinion. And I know I've said this many times in many different videos, but I just think it's been more so articulated in the latest chapter, and it's that Saitama is like the personification of absolute power, and that the audience maybe shouldn't necessarily look at him as like what a traditional character is. And I think that goes into why the story of One Punch Man is crafted the way that it is, with the interesting world and the interesting characters and the way that everything interacts with Saitama and the stakes that are built because of that. But before I go into that, let me just explain how Saitama lost his memories and what we learned of it in the latest chapter. So after Saitama successfully went back in time after Garo had taught him how to do it by essentially like manipulating dark energy and subatomic particles, he basically went to a parallel timeline that was technically in the past in relation to the future parallel world timeline that he had come from. And once he came back, he had defeated Garo with the Zero Punch, and his future form wound up merging with his past form. And because of this, he seemingly lost the memories of everything that had happened from chapter 166 to chapter 168. However, he was still holding Genos' core from the future, the core that was ripped out by Garo. And in the latest chapter, he gives Genos this core to check it out. And once Genos connects to it, it's revealed that somehow this core was like recording everything that had happened after it had been ripped out of him in the future timeline. But now Genos is aware of everything that had happened, and he tries to explain all of this to Saitama, but as we know, Saitama doesn't really care, and it kind of goes in one ear and out the other. But Genos basically tries to explain in this massive exposition dump that no matter how many parallel worlds exist, or infinite timelines or whatever, there are none in which Saitama would be defeated by Garo and that Saitama would allow everyone to die. One way or another, he would either defeat Garo, or he would find a way to transcend space and time to save everyone. And that basically Saitama will always transcend and manipulate the laws of causality. So this, along with the information that we got in the previous chapter about how Saitama's power is quite literally limitless, and that it will always essentially increase as long as you keep giving him an excuse to increase it, all of this together means that Saitama is infallible, essentially, and that he will never lose, and that he will always technically do what is needed to win or come out on top. And this goes back to what I said about him basically being the personification of absolute power. And I think that this is the character development that was needed for Saitama, at least more so for the audience, if anything. So basically what I'm saying is that it doesn't really matter if he had those memories or not, because when you say it will allow him to approach fights or dilemmas differently, it necessarily wouldn't, because he always will approach them correctly, regardless of if he had this experience and memories or not. Now, aside from that, another reason why I think this is probably a good idea is because it depowers Saitama. Because remember, like I said, Garo had pushed him so far on his own individual power level that he had become so powerful that he could just sneeze the surface of Jupiter away, right? But now that he's regressed back to his previous state, he's obviously no longer that strong strong, or at least he hasn't pushed himself to that level of strength, meaning that he's, you know, as strong as like the standard Saitama that we've come to know, which is as strong as he, you know, realistically needs to be at this point so that the stakes can stay the way that they were. But also him lacking those memories and experiences also allows him to have them again, or have a similar set of circumstances happen to him so that the story can progress without us having to think like, oh, well, he already knows all of that. You know what I mean? Because we are still relatively early on in the story. At least by my estimation, we still have at least 2 sagas to go through that are equal to or greater in length than the Monster Association saga. So in the end, I think this was all ultimately necessary, and I think that the core having all of this information on it is also important, not just for Saitama and Genos to know, but also because I think it's probably going to be a key going forward into the story. Kel Attar asks, can Saitama only be defeated in one punch? So Kel asks this because of what was revealed in chapter 166 of the Viz of One Punch Man, like how Saitama's power was explained. I also recently made a video about this where I said that in theory he would be able to defeat anyone in like a normal fight, you know, battle manga rules of course, outside of like opponents who would be nigh omnipotent like Marvel Cosmic Beings and etc. Because in that chapter when we see him fighting against Cosmic Fear Garo, it was said that until now no one had equaled him in strength or noticed his growth. However, due to intense emotions, his abilities were rising exponentially. He was even pulling away from the only person capable of observing his growth. And this was represented on multiple graphs, as to where we saw like Saitama basically started off at his standard level of strength that we've come to know of Saitama, like where one of his serious punches can blow away the collapsing star roaring cannon, split the sky, destroy Elder Centipede, or split the ocean, and make like a sparring match out of Meteoric Burst Boros. But as we came to know, Cosmic Fear Garo was much stronger than all of that stuff, and due to the energy abilities that he was given by God, along with his own inherent abilities, such as adapting to one's power and growing on the fly, he was able to continually match Saitama's strength as the fight went on. However, since Saitama removed his limiter, there is no limit to his power, and he could, in theory, always become stronger, which, like I said, is represented on the graph here, but in the final graph, we see that he becomes so strong that the narrator goes on to say that no one existed who could even fathom his new heights of strength, because he went from, you know, serious punching away collapsing star roaring cannon to now being so strong that one of his serious sneezes blows away the freaking surface of Jupiter. And that goes back to what I was saying about how, in theory, if he were to fight like a really strong opponent, let's just say someone even stronger than Cosmic Fear Garo, let's just say Goku for the fun of it, I'm not saying Saitama will defeat Goku, but just someone as strong as some of you imagine him to be, Saitama just could keep getting stronger and stronger and matching it, or just even surpassing him until the point of where Saitama would eventually win, because there are no limits to his power and his growth. But that also raises the major question of like, okay, so how can Saitama be defeated then? And like I said in my Saitama Power Explained video, I do think Saitama will eventually be defeated in the future of the series, but not like in a traditional fight. He's gonna be like tricked, I guess you can say, and he'll be out of commission for a little bit, or at least that's the way that I see one playing out the story, and I'll make a separate video about that, of course, eventually. I'm getting around to it, don't worry. But outside of just that, in like a regular standard battle manga fight, excluding nigh omnipotent opponents, the only real way to stop him, I guess, would be to take him out in one shot. And that goes back to what Kel said here by is the only way to stop him in one punch. But that just basically means like one shot, one strike, whatever it is. Because if you don't, then he's just going to progressively get stronger and stronger, no matter how strong his opponent is. Now, how strong does that shot or whatever attack needs to be? Well, I don't know, because we saw that Cosmic Fear Garo hit Saitama with a freaking gamma ray burst, and that was, you know, just regular Saitama for the most part, right? And that didn't even leave a scratch on him. So it needs to be something stronger than that, pretty much. Now, how strong does it need to be? Like I said, I don't know. You can just use your imagination for this. Some of you will say, oh, solar system level feat or galaxy, it doesn't matter. Just something strong enough to take him out in one shot, because if you don't, then as the graph indicates, he's going to keep getting stronger and stronger, even much stronger than the point of blowing away the surface of Jupiter with a sneeze. Majiboros asks, hey Z, what are your thoughts on the theory that Saitama's true final opponent will be himself, or an evil version of himself, fighting for eternity, and God was just a facade, and really his true opponent is fighting himself? So this is a really interesting one, and I've seen this talked about before, actually like a few years ago even, but it's become more popular now because, you know, we've gotten a better look at God and all of the time travel stuff has been introduced. So I guess this posits that God is like an alternate version of Saitama, either from like another timeline or from another universe or something, and that this version of Saitama that God is like, what if Saitama just became evil and lost his way and his power altered into making him into this creature monster thing that he is now. And I guess this also goes more into possibly what Genos was talking about, more or less, maybe just a little bit about how essentially Saitama could be like a universal constant, not necessarily just the Saitama that we see Genos talking to, as to where regardless of what had happened, no matter how many times it happened, Saitama would ultimately do the right thing. But maybe there is some instances where he doesn't, and that version of Saitama was either born inherently evil or just lost his path along the way, you know, on his journey to power, and he monsterfied or invented monstrification, possibly, because I assume that's where monstrification came from in the first place. Also, if this god is Saitama, then he's very different from the Saitama that we know. God appears to be extremely intelligent, like beyond comprehension almost, because when he made Garo his avatar, it said that Garo gained the knowledge of the flow of all energy and the behavior of all forces in the universe, implying that God pretty much already knew this himself since he was able to give it to Garo. And that makes sense because of, you know, what God is capable of. Like everything that Garo was doing, God can essentially do himself, right? So he knows all of this stuff, and obviously Saitama doesn't. So it could be like some evil genius version of Saitama possibly that removed his limiter, but it just took him in a different direction. And instead of just using raw power, he manipulates, you know, the forces of the universe instead. And maybe that reality's S-class heroes are the ones who wound up sealing it. You know, what is implied to have happened with God if we go off the whole Knights and the Dragonbone story from the webcomic, which, you know, parallels to the Osiris myth from Egyptian mythology. Talked about that many times too. Maybe they were the ones that sealed him in the cube, possibly, and, you know, chopped it up or whatever. But there's not really much to go off of, to be honest. Like, there's not a lot of evidence that supports this in the series at all, other than the similarities of God maybe being bald and kind of looking like Saitama in that sense. But other than that, it's kind of just wishful thinking, and it sounds cool, I guess, kind of fanficky, but in my opinion, I just don't think this is the case. Now, like I said, there's a small chance that this could happen. Sure, I don't want to shoot your hopes down, or if you have these grand theories, it's fine, go ahead and have them. But like, you know, I also said there's just nearly no evidence to go off of with this, other than maybe that's why one introduced time travel, because this is like a time paradox thing going on, and that God is a Saitama from another past or universe, and he came here because he had to for some reason. But I just don't think so. I think God is his own individual unique character, not Saitama or related to him, and he probably comes from that universe, more or less, if not from another dimension that's connected to it, like the place that we see Blast, or if that dimension was created to seal God. It seems like he's probably like an alien or something, and he just goes from planet to planet until the original group that Blast comes from like sealed him back in the day, and then they kind of just passed down that duty until it came to Blast, and then that other Boros looking guy, and then the lion and the elf girl and everyone else. I mean, it's going to be a while before this stuff is revealed, but I just wouldn't bet on God being some kind of version of Saitama or something like that. But there's always going to be theories like this, because remember, like before Blast was revealed, a lot of people thought that Blast was Saitama or something, remember? But yeah, I don't think so. 52 Sam RJ asks, thanks for your video, I really love them. It's been 1.5 years. Hey, thanks Sam, I really appreciate the super thanks. What do you think about Saitama? All powers from God? God must lost his power, that's why he's really doing this, right? So I think you're asking if Saitama's powers come from God, or Saitama stole them from him somehow, or God lost his powers and that's why he's doing this, you know, going after Saitama. So first of all, let me just say that I don't think Saitama's powers come from God in any way. I think what Dr. Genos tells us in chapter 86 is pretty much the truth when he says that he was a normal person of ordinary birth with an ordinary lifestyle and no particular talent, yet through sheer effort he forced open his limits and demolished his limiter. Like, I think that's where it starts and ends. Like, there's nothing special about Saitama other than he was just the seemingly first person to remove his limiter, possibly. Now, as for God, I do think he lost his powers, and he's definitely going after Saitama for a reason, but I don't think it's because he lost his powers, more so that I think Saitama is ultimately a threat to him. But before I go any any further, let me just say that it's really hard to figure out exactly what's going on because we don't really have that much information yet. But what we do have, or what we can try to make of some of these potential clues that one gave us, might give us a clearer image of what is truly going on. So in chapter 119 of the webcomic, we find out about the cruel dragon and the saints and the death bone and the cubes and all that stuff. And while this is played for comedic effect, although I do think the cruel dragon is definitely like a real thing, at least in the manga, because we recently saw that his temple arose to the surface from the ocean. But I think this story more so is telling us what happened to God, because it also parallels to the Osiris myth. And I think that God is based heavily off of Osiris, the Egyptian god of the moon. But they tell Saitama that ancient soldiers gathered together and with a great many sacrifices managed to weaken the cruel dragon. And in this case, I think the cruel dragon is the cruel dragon, but also is meant to mirror God. Seal Master separated the essence of the dragon using 9 seal stones and sealed them in 9 temples scattered across the land. And as we see, these seal stones pretty much represent the cubes that we know in the manga. So I think this is what happened to God. Like at some point in the past, seal masters separated his essence and sealed him using the cubes, or the cubes are part of him or something like that. But you know, we see that God is basically trapped. The way that he's pictured in the fetal position, but also the fact that he can never really like tangibly interact with our world. He always has to go through somebody else. Another reason I think this is true is because in chapter 162, when Garou hits Saitama with the Fa Jin, it sends like this shockwave through Earth. And that's actually when the Cruel Dragon Temple surfaces from the ocean. But we also see Blast in another dimension with his team reacting to this. And he says the Earth's magnetism and gravitational fields are out of whack. Space is warping and a hole is opening in the dimensional seal. It's going to break. To repair, stat. So dimensional seal, repair it. This is clearly like where God is being held. So I'm thinking that these seal masters or whoever, ancient aliens or whatever, sealed God in this other dimension. And that's why he is currently trapped there. So yes, he did lose his powers, but he still has them in a way. He just can't use them. And as for why he wants Saitama or why he's interested in him, and I assume this is in reference to what had recently been said in chapter 173 by Sitch, when he says that Blast says God is intervening in this dimension more often because something here is attracting its attention, and we see Saitama when he says this. And I think that's because Saitama is like the biggest threat to God because he removed his limiter. Because going back to chapter 86, Dr. Gina says that an overabundance of strength is a burden to its bearer, giving rise to complications, and those who become monsters shed their original selves and rage out of control. For that reason, God has designed each creature to grow within parameters that allow for survival and preservation of reason, and the mechanism for controlling that growth is called a limiter. Now, when Dr. Gina says God, I think he's probably talking about nature and whatnot. I don't think he really is aware of who God, the being that we're talking about, you know, the main villain of One Punch Man is. I mean, he could, but I don't think he does. But I do think that this is probably one cleverly writing this as he is saying that it is God, meaning that it's possible that God like literally put the limiter on humanity, or just most beings that he's able to have interactions with. Now, how he possibly did this, I talk about in my Egyptian mythology Truth About One Punch Man videos, but the long and the short of it is he contaminated the food and the water. But now that Saitama has broken out of that and removed his limiter, so he's essentially unstoppable. He's direct threat to God. So since Saitama has removed his limiter, God has been going crazy and just trying to get through the barrier more, but also summoning more monsters so that they can progressively get stronger and stronger in order to stop Saitama. But another possible reason he's interested in Saitama because he wants to use him as the sacrifice to resurrect him to the earth, because that could also parallel to what Orochi was trying to do with Saitama in chapter 112, when he shows Saitama the altar underneath the Monster Association. Now, of course, Orochi mistakenly thought that this altar was depicting his own resurrection into a god because he couldn't see the full altar with God above him. But he didn't realize that Orochi himself was supposed to be the sacrifice, and he chose Saitama to be that, where he's like, you know, fate led you all the way here to be that sacrifice. Now fight with me like all the other battle trials and offer me your flesh. Now I shall begin the resurrection ceremony of the evil god. So like I said, that could parallel to what God also wants for Saitama. Use him as the sacrifice instead of Orochi. But either way, I think this just ultimately means that God wants to get rid of Saitama because he's his biggest threat.